This is a true story of a choice no one should ever have to make, and the men who made it anyway. In March 1943, a merchant convoy designated HX-229 steamed eastward across the North Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, and ammunition desperately needed by Britain. Aboard those ships, men like Tom Williams, a 22-year-old stoker from Liverpool who'd promised his mother he'd come home safe, and Captain James Forsyth, a veteran of the last war who knew these waters better than anyone alive. What these men didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that 300 miles away, in a country mansion at Bletchley Park, British code breakers had already read the German Enigma messages. They knew exactly where the U-boat Wolfpack was waiting. They knew the convoy was sailing directly into an ambush. And they knew that if they warned the convoy and saved those lives, the Germans would realize their codes had been broken. And the ultra-secret, the intelligence advantage that was winning the war, would be lost. So the officials made a decision. They let HX-229 sail on. And over 3 nights, in March 1943, 21 ships were sunk, and over 350 men died in the freezing water. Men whose deaths might have been prevented by a single decoded message. What you're about to hear is the story of that convoy, the code breakers who knew it was doomed, and the terrible mathematics of war. When is it right to sacrifice some lives to save others? And who gets to make that choice? March 8, 1943. Aboard SS William Eustace. Mid-Atlantic, Tom Williams stood on the deck of the SS William Eustace, watching the grey Atlantic roll past under a pale winter sky. He was 22 years old, from Liverpool, with dark hair that never stayed combed and a photograph of his mother tucked inside his jacket pocket. He'd signed on as a stoker, shoveling coal in the engine room, because the pay was good and because he wanted to do something, anything to help win the war. His mother had cried when he left. "Promise me you'll come back," she'd said, holding his hands too tight. And he had promised, even though he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Merchant sailors had the highest casualty rate of any service in the war. U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be built. But someone had to keep the convoys running. Britain was an island. Without food and fuel from America, it would starve. Tom looked out at the other ships in the convoy, 40 of them, spread across several miles of ocean, moving slowly eastward at about 8 knots. Cargo ships, tankers, freighters. Some were old and battered, held together with rust and prayer. Others were newer, faster, but just as vulnerable. All of them were low in the water, heavy with cargo. Bounty states, food, aviation fuel, trucks, ammunition, steel. Protecting them were a handful of escort ships, destroyers and corvettes, outnumbered and outgunned if a wolf pack found them. Tom had heard the stories. Convoys attacked at night, torpedoes striking without warning, ships exploding, burning, sinking in minutes, men in the water, screaming for help that never came. He lit a cigarette and tried not to think about it. Nearby, Captain James Forsyth stood on the bridge, studying the horizon through binoculars. Forsyth was 48, a career merchant officer who'd survived the First World War and had been sailing the Atlantic for 30 years. He knew every trick, zigzag patterns to confuse submarines, radio silence to avoid detection, convoy discipline to keep ships together. But he also knew that sometimes none of it mattered. Sometimes the U-boats found you anyway. He lowered the binoculars and checked the convoy chart. They were 4 days out from New York, still 3 days from the safety of air cover near Britain. This was the Black Gap, the mid-Atlantic stretch beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats hunted freely. Forsyth had a bad feeling. The weather was calm, too calm. Calm seas meant U-boats could surface at night and attack on the surface, where they were faster and harder to detect. And intelligence reports had been vague but ominous. Heavy U-boat activity expected in grid squares BE-14 through BE-18. That covered a lot of ocean, but it included their route. He looked at the young radio man standing nearby. "Any updates from the Admiralty?" "No, sir. Just the standard orders. Maintain course and speed. No rerouting." Forsyth nodded slowly. He'd been hoping for new instructions. A course change, a diversion, anything to avoid the danger zone. But the orders were clear. Stay on course. He turned back to the window and watched the convoy plow forward into the empty grey sea. March 9th, 1943, 2 a.m. Hut 8, Bletchley Park, England. 300 miles away, in a cramped, smoke-filled room lit by a single overhead bulb, a young cryptanalyst named Peter Ashford stared at a freshly decrypted Enigma message on his desk. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, though the room was freezing, but from what he'd just read. The message was from U-Boat Command, BDU, to a group of submarines operating in the North Atlantic. It gave grid coordinates for an intercept point and a time window, and it mentioned a convoy, HX-2229. Peter checked the coordinates against the convoy routing charts pinned to the wall. His stomach dropped. The U-boats were positioned directly in the convoy's path. At current speed, HX-229 would reach the ambush point in less than 48 hours. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his cold cup of tea, and walked to the office of his supervisor, Commander Edward Travis, head of Bletchley Park's Naval Intelligence Section. Travis was still at his desk. Even at 2 o'clock a.m., he rarely slept. "Sir, we've got a problem." Travis looked up, his face gray with exhaustion. "Show me." Peter handed him the decrypt. Travis read it once, then again, his jaw tightening. "How many U-boats?" "At least 11 confirmed in the Wolfpack, sir. Possibly more." "And the convoy?" 40 ships, minimal escort. They're sailing straight into it." Travis leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. This was the nightmare scenario. Bletchley Park had been breaking German naval enigma since 1941, giving the Allies an enormous advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. But the advantage only worked if the Germans didn't know it existed. And that meant being very, very careful about how they used the intelligence. If they rerouted HX-229 now, suddenly, without explanation, the Germans would get suspicious. They would start asking questions. How did the Allies know where the U-boats were? Did someone talk? Was there a spy? Or worse, was the code broken? If the Germans even suspected that Enigma was compromised, they would change their encryption procedures immediately, and Bletchley Park would be back to square one, blind, deaf, and unable to protect any convoys. But if they didn't reroute the convoy, those men would die. Travis opened his eyes. "Get me the Admiralty, now." March 9th, 1943, 4 o'clock a.m. Admiralty, Operations Room, London. By 4 o'clock a.m., a small group of senior officers had gathered in a secure room at the Admiralty in London. Among them, Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, the command responsible for Atlantic convoy protection, and representatives from Naval Intelligence and the War Cabinet. On the table in front of them, the decrypted Enigma message, a map showing HX-229's position and the U-boat Wolfpack, and a stack of reports on recent convoy losses. Admiral Horton spoke first, his voice clipped and controlled. "Gentlemen, the situation is clear. We know where the U-boats are. We know where the convoy is. If we do nothing, HX-229 will be attacked within 2 days. Losses could be catastrophic." One of the intelligence officers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "If we reroute the convoy, we risk exposing Ultra. The Germans will ask how we knew. They'll investigate. And if they change their codes, we lose the advantage that's been winning us this war. And if we don't reroute," another officer said quietly, "we're condemning those men to death." Silence. Horton rubbed his face. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, which he probably hadn't. "How many ships in the convoy?" 40, sir, mostly cargo and tankers. Escort strength, 4 destroyers, 2 corvettes. Against 11 U-boats? At least 11, sir, possibly more. Horton looked at the map. He'd been fighting this war for years. He'd seen convoys torn apart, sailors burned alive in flaming oil, bodies floating in the wreckage. He knew what was coming for HX-229 if they didn't act, but he also knew the bigger picture. Ultra intelligence had been decisive in turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. Without it, the Allies were losing, badly. U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. Britain was weeks away from starvation. Ultra had changed that. It had saved thousands of lives by rerouting convoys around U-boat positions, directing escorts to intercept submarines, and protecting supply lines. If they lost Ultra now, all of that would be undone. Horton looked around the table. Options? One officer suggested a compromise. We could stage a reconnaissance flight over the area, make it look like we spotted the U-boats by air, then reroute based on that. In the middle of the Black Gap? There's no air cover there. The Germans know that. They'll be suspicious. What if we reroute just slightly? Not a full diversion, but enough to avoid the worst of the ambush. That might work, another officer said, but it might not, and if it doesn't, we've exposed Ultra for nothing. The debate went on for an hour. Every option was considered, every risk was weighed, and in the end they came back to the same brutal calculus. If they saved HX-229 and lost Ultra, they would lose far more convoys in the weeks and months ahead. The strategic advantage that Ultra provided, seeing the enemy's moves before they made them, was too valuable to risk. Admiral Horton made the decision. We hold course. No rerouting. HX-229 continues on its current heading. Someone at the table exhaled slowly, as if they'd been holding their breath. God help us, Horton said quietly. And God help them. March 16th to 17th, 1943. Aboard SS William Eustis. Night. It started just after midnight. Tom Williams was in the engine room, shoveling coal into the furnace, when he heard the explosion. It was distant but unmistakable, a dull, heavy thud that you felt in your chest more than heard. He stopped, listening. Then another explosion, closer this time. "We're under attack," someone shouted. Tom dropped the shovel and ran for the ladder, climbing up to the deck. The night was black. No moon, no stars, just darkness and the smell of salt and diesel, but on the horizon he could see flames. One of the ships in the convoy, a tanker, was burning, a pillar of orange fire rising into the sky. Then another explosion, this one so close Tom could feel the shockwave. A freighter less than a mile away took a torpedo amidships. It listed violently, water pouring into the hull, and within minutes it was gone, vanished beneath the waves. Sailors were running everywhere, shouting, trying to get to the lifeboats. The escort ships were firing depth charges, trying to drive off the U-boats, but it was chaos. The U-boats were attacking on the surface, moving fast, picking off ships one by one. Captain Forsyth stood on the bridge, gripping the railing, his face lit by the fires burning around them. "All hands to stations. Prepare to abandon ship if necessary." Tom ran to his assigned lifeboat station and waited, heart pounding, watching the sea. Somewhere out there, invisible in the dark, submarines were hunting them. Then he saw it. A white streak in the water, moving fast. A torpedo wake, heading straight for them. "Torpedo!" someone screamed. The torpedo struck the William Eustis on the port side just below the waterline. The explosion was deafening. The ship shuddered, groaned, and began to list. Tom was thrown against the railing, his ears ringing. Water was pouring in. The ship was sinking. "Abandon ship! Abandon ship!" Tom grabbed his life vest and jumped. The water was shockingly cold, so cold it drove the air from his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, and looked around. The William Eustis was going down fast, the bow already underwater. Men were in the water everywhere, shouting, swimming toward lifeboats, clinging to debris. Tom swam toward a lifeboat and was pulled aboard by another sailor. They sat there, shivering, watching their ship sink. It took less than 10 minutes. Then it was gone, and all that remained was wreckage and the cries of men still in the water. The attack continued for 3 more hours. By dawn, 21 ships had been sunk. Over 350 men were dead. Tom survived. Captain Forsyth did not. His body was never recovered. Hut 8, Bletchley Park. The morning, after Peter Ashford read the casualty report in silence. 21 ships lost. 353 men dead. He'd known it was coming. He'd read the Enigma messages. He'd watched the Wolfpack assemble. And he'd sat in his chair at Bletchley Park, breaking codes, while men died because of a decision someone else had made. He looked around the room. The other code breakers were working, heads down, pretending not to notice. But he could feel it. The weight, the guilt, the knowledge that they had seen this coming and done nothing. One of his colleagues, a woman named Joan, came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault, Peter." "Isn't it?" he said quietly. "We knew. We could have warned them. And if we had, we'd lose Ultra, and thousands more would die. That's what they tell us, because it's true." Peter didn't answer. He just stared at the casualty report and thought about the men who had drowned in the freezing Atlantic, because someone far away, safe and dry, had decided their lives were worth less than a secret. In the years after the war, the story of HX-229 and other sacrificed convoys became one of the most controversial aspects of the ultra-secret. Some historians argue that the decision was justified, that protecting Ultra saved far more lives in the long run than it cost in individual tragedies like HX-229. Without Ultra, the Battle of the Atlantic might have been lost, and Britain might have been starved into surrender. Others argue that the decision was morally indefensible, that no government has the right to deliberately allow its own citizens to die, no matter their strategic justification. And the men who made those decisions, many of them carried the guilt for the rest of their lives. Admiral Horton never spoke publicly about the decisions he made during the war, but those who knew him said he was haunted by the convoys he couldn't save, or chose not to. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park were sworn to secrecy for decades. Most of them never told anyone, not their families, not their friends, about the work they had done or the knowledge they had carried, and some of them never forgave themselves for knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it. One Bletchley Park veteran, interviewed decades later, said, "We broke the codes, we saved lives, but we also watched men die because we couldn't use what we knew, and that's something I've never been able to make peace with." Now I want you to think about something. Was it right? Was it right to let HX-229 sail into an ambush to protect the ultra-secret? Was it right to sacrifice 350 men to save thousands or millions in the future? Would you have made the same choice? Imagine you're Admiral Horton, sitting in that room at 4 o'clock a.m. with the map in front of you and the casualty reports piling up. Would you have rerouted the convoy and risked losing Ultra? Or would you have let them sail on, knowing what was waiting for them? And here's the hardest question of all. Do governments have the right to make these calculations? To decide that some lives are worth more than others? To sacrifice the few to save the many? Or is that a line we should never cross, no matter the cost? I want you to leave a comment and tell me what you think. Because this isn't just history. This is a question that governments still face today, in war rooms, in intelligence agencies, in moments when someone has to decide who lives and who dies. Was the sacrifice of HX-229 justified? Were those 350 men martyrs to a greater cause, or were they victims of a system that valued secrecy over human life? You tell me, if you found this story challenging, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you question what you thought you knew about right and wrong, share this video. Subscribe. Because the hardest stories, the ones that don't have easy answers, are the ones we need most. The convoy sailed on, the codebreakers stayed silent, and 350 men died so that a secret could live. Was it worth it?